Ayanna Jamieson arrived at the bustling airport terminal early in the morning. Her carry-on slung over one arm and her other hand resting instinctively on her rounded belly. She moved deliberately. Her gait slowed by the weight she carried, not just the physical burden of pregnancy, but the intangible heaviness of traveling alone in a world that often felt indifferent to women like her. The line at the check-in counter snaked across the floor, passengers shifting impatiently as announcements crackled overhead. Ayanna stood quietly, observing her surroundings. She noticed a young white woman a few spots ahead, visibly pregnant like herself, being waved forward by a cheerful attendant who cooed, "Oh, let's get you taken care of, sweetie." Ayanna shifted her weight to her other foot, glancing down at her boarding pass, wondering if she might receive the same courtesy. By the time she reached the counter, the attendant didn't look up. "Name?" the woman asked curtly, tapping at her keyboard with mechanical efficiency. "Ayanna Jamieson," she replied softly, sliding her ID and boarding pass across the counter. The attendant glanced at her, eyes flicking momentarily to her stomach, then returned to the screen. "Bag to check?" "No, just this," Ayanna said, patting the handle of her carry-on. The attendant nodded, printed her ticket, and handed it back without another word. No offer of assistance, no acknowledgement of her pregnancy. Ayanna thanked her anyway and stepped aside, careful not to let the exchange linger in her mind. She had grown accustomed to these small slights, so small, in fact, that they were easily dismissed by those who didn't experience them. But Ayanna had long ago learned that the sum of such moments was not small at all. As she made her way to the security line, she couldn't help but replay the interaction. She wasn't expecting special treatment. Not really. But there was something sharp-edged about being ignored so thoroughly. A feeling that lingered like the dull ache in her lower back. She watched as other passengers were greeted warmly, their needs anticipated before they even asked. A man offered to help an elderly woman lift her suitcase. A child struggling to carry a backpack was gently assisted by a TSA agent. Acts of kindness surrounded her, yet seemed to flow around her, never quite reaching her. The security checkpoint was no different. Ayanna removed her shoes and jacket, placing them in the gray plastic bin with practiced efficiency. She walked through the scanner, her hands instinctively shielding her stomach as if the machine might do harm. The agent on the other side motioned for her to wait. "Ma'am, step to the side for a pat down," the woman said, her tone brisk but not unkind. Ayanna complied, standing silently as gloved hands swept over her body. She had done this before, and she would likely do it again. There was no explanation given. But there never was. She didn't ask questions, she just wanted to move on. At the gate, Ayanna found a seat near the window and settled in. She pulled out a small bottle of water and sipped it slowly, her hand never leaving her stomach. The gate agent began calling for priority boarding families with small children, passengers needing extra assistance. Ayanna waited, watching as others filed past her. When her zone was finally called, she stood and approached the counter. "Excuse me," she began hesitantly. "I'm traveling while pregnant." The agent cut her off with a flat, "Zone 3, ma'am," pointing toward the line forming on the other side of the podium. Ayanna nodded, her words catching in her throat. She joined the queue without argument, her steps slow and measured. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting. Maybe just a moment of acknowledgement, some small recognition of her condition. But she knew better than to expect too much. As she settled into her seat at the back of the plane, Ayanna gazed out the window at the tarmac below. The engines hummed softly, a sound that was oddly soothing. She let her eyes close for a moment, feeling the baby shift inside her. There was no anger in her heart, no fiery indignation. What she felt instead was quieter, heavier, an ache that was harder to name. It was the kind of pain that came not from a single cut, but from the 1,000 tiny pinpricks of being unseen. The plane began to taxi, and Ayanna opened her eyes. This journey was just beginning, but the weight of it was already pressing down on her. Still, she breathed deeply and let the hum of the engines carry her forward. The boarding area was alive with the quiet chaos that always seemed to accompany air travel. Families clustered together, juggling strollers and diaper bags. Business travelers tapped furiously at their phones. Their rolling briefcases balanced neatly at their sides. Ayana sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, observing it all with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Her seat was positioned near the gate agent's desk, close enough to hear the occasional snippets of conversation. "We'll get you a wheelchair right away," the agent said warmly to an elderly man who smiled gratefully. A young couple with matching backpacks approached next, and the agent waved them forward with a cheerful, "Honeymoon? Oh, enjoy your trip." Ayana listened in silence, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She told herself it didn't matter. These were just polite interactions, meaningless pleasantries. And yet, as she watched the gate agent's demeanor shift seamlessly from one passenger to the next, she couldn't help but notice the subtle ways the tone changed. The warmth, the attentiveness, it was never quite directed her way. She glanced at the screen displaying the boarding order. Her Zone 3 was still a few minutes away. Across the aisle, another pregnant woman, blonde and visibly further along, was struggling to organize her carry-ons. Before Ayana could offer help, one of the flight attendants stepped forward, her face lighting up with a smile. "Oh, sweetie, let me take that for you," she said, scooping up the woman's bag with ease. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything before we board?" The woman laughed lightly, her hand resting on her belly. "Oh, I'm fine, just a little clumsy these days." "Well, you take your time," the attendant said, her voice honey sweet. "We'll make sure you're all set." Ayana looked down at her own bag. The handle was scuffed from years of use, the zipper frayed at the edges. She had packed lightly, careful not to burden herself, knowing there would be no one to help if her load became too heavy. Her thoughts drifted to her unborn child, to the world waiting for them outside the confines of her body. She wondered how much of this quiet, unspoken inequality they would one day inherit. How many times would her child be overlooked, dismissed, or treated as an afterthought? How many times had it already happened to Ayana herself, without her even realizing it? The boarding announcement for Zone 3 pulled her from her thoughts. She rose slowly, her back aching as she adjusted the strap of her carry-on. As she approached the line, the gate agent barely glanced at her. "Boarding pass," the woman said briskly, her eyes already moving to the next passenger. Ayana handed it over, her fingers brushing against the worn paper. The agent scanned it and handed it back without a word. Ayana thanked her anyway, her voice quiet but steady. As she made her way down the jet bridge, she couldn't help but replay the last hour in her mind. She thought of the blonde woman, the ease with which she had been cared for. There was nothing dramatic about the difference in their experiences. No one had shouted or pointed fingers. But the absence of hostility didn't mean the presence of equality. It was in the subtleties and the warmth that was given to some and withheld from others that the lines were drawn. Stepping onto the plane, Ayana found her seat near the back. She stowed her bag and sat down, her hands returning instinctively to her stomach. The cabin filled slowly, passengers shuffling past her without a glance. She didn't mind the solitude. It was familiar, even comforting in its way. As the plane filled with the hum of conversation and the rustling of belongings, Ayana closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise fade into the background. She thought about her mother, who had often told her, "The world isn't fair, but you still have to walk through it with your head held high." It was a lesson Ayana had learned early, one she carried with her now as she prepared for the journey ahead. The engine rumbled to life, and the plane began its slow crawl toward the runway. Ayana opened her eyes and looked out the window, the expanse of the tarmac stretching wide before her. The plane paused, waiting its turn to take off. And for a moment, everything was still. In that stillness, Ayana let out a quiet breath. She didn't know what awaited her at the end of this flight. But she knew this: she would keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to hold her back. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers settled into their seats, their movements accompanied by the muted rustling of coats and carry-ons. Ayana adjusted her seatbelt, careful not to let it press too tightly against her belly. The plane's air was already thick with the familiar blend of too many people and recycled air, a sharp contrast to the open expanse of the tarmac outside. A flight attendant's voice broke through the cabin noise, crisp and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, We ask that you please stow your belongings and take your seats. We'll be departing shortly. Ayana glanced at the aisle, where a middle-aged woman was attempting to hoist her oversized suitcase into the overhead bin. The woman, wearing a perfectly pressed blazer and heels that seemed more suited for a boardroom than a plane, was clearly struggling. Ayana shifted slightly in her seat, contemplating whether to offer assistance. But a flight attendant appeared almost instantly. "Let me help you with that," the attendant said, her tone light and accommodating. The woman flashed a grateful smile, stepping aside to let the bag be secured. Ayana's gaze lingered on the interaction. She didn't resent the help the woman received. It was, after all, the flight attendant's job. But as she watched, she couldn't help but recall her own experience just minutes earlier, when she had struggled to lift her own carry-on into the compartment. No one had offered assistance then. She had managed on her own, as she always did. Across the aisle, a younger woman with sleek blonde hair caught Ayana's attention. She was seated next to a window, her hand resting on her rounded stomach. Pregnant, too, Ayana thought, though likely further along than herself. As if sensing Ayana's gaze, the woman looked up and smiled faintly. Ayana nodded in return, her own smile polite but restrained. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, checking seat belts and securing trays. Ayana noticed how one of them paused by the blonde woman's seat, her voice dropping to a tone that was almost maternal. "How are you feeling today? Everything okay?" the attendant asked warmly. The woman smiled again, her hand brushing over her stomach. "I'm fine, thank you. Let us know if you need anything at all," the attendant said before moving on, her expression soft and reassuring. Ayana turned her gaze back to her lap, her fingers absently smoothing the fabric of her dress. She wasn't angry, she rarely allowed herself to be, but the moment lingered in her mind. It wasn't just about the words or the actions. It was about what those words and actions meant. The blonde woman's pregnancy was acknowledged, cared for, even celebrated. Ayana's was invisible. The plane began to taxi, the hum of the engines growing louder. Ayana leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes briefly. She thought of Malik, her partner, and the way he always spoke to her belly as if the baby could already hear him. "You're so strong," he would say, his hand resting gently on hers. "Our little one is lucky to have you." The plane lifted off the ground, the familiar pull of gravity making her stomach lurch. Ayana opened her eyes and looked out the window, the city shrinking below her. She let herself focus on the view, letting it calm her. The flight attendant came down the aisle again, offering drinks and snacks. When she reached Ayana's row, her tone was polite but distant. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked without meeting Ayana's eyes. "Just water, please," Ayana replied, her voice steady. The attendant handed her a small plastic cup, already moving on to the next row. Across the aisle, the blonde woman was engaged in cheerful conversation with a different attendant, who offered her an extra pillow and blanket. Ayana sipped her water, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. She didn't expect extra pillows or special treatment. She didn't even expect kindness, necessarily, but she couldn't ignore the quiet difference in how care was offered so freely to some, and so sparingly to others. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Ayana pulled a book from her bag, its pages worn from repeated readings. She tried to lose herself in the words, but her mind kept drifting back to the interactions she had witnessed. They weren't overt acts of discrimination. No one had said anything cruel or explicitly unfair. And yet, the imbalance was unmistakable, woven into the fabric of the day's events like a subtle but persistent thread. Ayana closed the book and looked out the window again. The sky was vast and endless, stretching beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there, far below, was the world she would bring her child into, a world she hoped might one day be different. But for now, it was what it was, imperfect, unequal, and achingly familiar. She let out a quiet sigh, her breath misting the cool glass. For now, all she could do was sit still and wait, as she had always done. The hum of the engines had become a steady background rhythm, a sound so constant it was easy to forget. Passengers were settling into their routines, flipping through magazines, tapping on phones, or dozing under thin blankets. Ayana adjusted her seatbelt again, the tension across her belly growing more uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat. But the ache in her back refused to ease. She pressed the call button, her finger hovering for just a moment before committing. She didn't like to draw attention to herself. But the discomfort was becoming harder to ignore. The soft chime sounded above her. And she waited. It took longer than she expected. A flight attendant finally appeared. Her expression neutral but far from warm. Yes, she said. Her tone clipped. Her gaze fixed somewhere over Ayana's shoulder. I'm not feeling very well. Ayana began, keeping her voice steady and calm. I think I might need some water and maybe a little help. Is it an emergency? The attendant interrupted. Her eyebrows lifting slightly. We're not really supposed to leave our service area right now. Ayana blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I wouldn't say emergency, but I'm pregnant, and I'm feeling faint. The attendant's sigh was audible. A quiet but deliberate sound that settled over Ayana like a weight. I'll see what I can do, she said before turning away, her heels clicking softly against the aisle. Ayana leaned back in her seat, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach. She glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had noticed the exchange. A few rows ahead, the same blonde woman from earlier was speaking to another attendant. Her face lit up in a soft smile. A bottle of water and a package of crackers were handed to her with care. The attendant crouching slightly to meet her eye level. The contrast was sharp, undeniable. Is everything okay? The voice startled Ayana, and she turned to see the woman sitting next to her. She was younger, with a kind face framed by loose brown hair. Her expression was open, genuinely concerned. I'm fine, Ayana replied automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. The woman tilted her head, her concern deepening. You pressed the call button a while ago. Did they help you? Ayana hesitated, unsure of how much to share. She settled on a small shrug. They're busy, I guess. The woman frowned slightly but didn't press further. Instead, she reached into her own bag and pulled out a bottle of water. Holding it out to Ayana. Here, you should have this. Ayana took the bottle, murmuring a soft, thank you. The kindness, so simple yet so rare in her day so far, felt almost startling. The attendant eventually returned, a small cup of water in hand. She placed it on Ayana's tray table without a word and turned away before Ayana could respond. Ayana stared at the cup for a moment, the gesture feeling more like an obligation than an act of care. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or dismissed. As the flight continued, Ayana found herself thinking about her mother again. Her mother had a way of seeing the world for what it was, sharp-edged and uneven, but always managing to soften its blows with her wisdom. It's not always about what they say, her mother used to tell her. It's about what they don't say. About what they don't do. The words felt particularly true now. The flight attendant had done nothing overtly wrong. She had brought the water. After all, but the absence of kindness, of recognition, carried a weight of its own. It was the kind of weight that settled in the spaces between words. In the pause of a sigh. In the averted glance that said, "You're not my priority." The young woman beside her spoke again, breaking the silence. "I'm Emily, by the way." Ayana turned to her, offering a small smile. Ayana. Emily nodded, her expression soft. "If you need anything, just let me know, okay?" Ayana's smile grew a little, the sincerity in Emily's voice cutting through the haze of exhaustion. "Thank you, that's very kind." The rest of the flight passed slowly, the cabin lights dimming as passengers settled in for the long journey. Ayana closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines fill the silence. The discomfort in her back hadn't gone away, but the weight in her chest felt just a little lighter. Sometimes, it seemed, even the smallest gestures could shift the balance. As she rested, Ayana thought again of her child, of the world they would one day inherit. She didn't have answers to all the questions that swirled in her mind. But she knew this, the journey would be long. And it wouldn't always be fair. But even in the midst of indifference, there would be moments of kindness, quiet, fleeting, but powerful enough to make the weight just a little easier to carry. The cabin lights had dimmed to a muted glow as the flight entered its mid-journey calm. Most passengers had settled into their routines, some sleeping, others lost in books or movies. Ayana, however, was wide awake, the discomfort in her lower back refusing to subside. She shifted in her seat, trying to find a position that might bring relief. Across the aisle, Emily glanced over, her brows knitting slightly. Still not feeling well? She asked softly. Ayanna gave a small shake of her head, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. It's manageable, she said, her voice low. I've had worse. Emily nodded but didn't look convinced. She glanced toward the front of the cabin where the flight attendants were stationed. Their voices faint but audible. You shouldn't have to manage it alone, she said after a moment. Let me see if I can talk to someone for you. Before Ayanna could protest, Emily had unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, walking purposefully down the aisle. Ayanna watched her go, torn between gratitude and unease. She wasn't used to people stepping in on her behalf, and she wasn't sure how it would be received. Emily reached the galley, where two attendants were chatting quietly. One of them, Ayanna recognized, was the same woman who had responded so curtly to her earlier. Emily spoke in a low voice, her tone calm but firm. The attendant's posture stiffened slightly as she listened, her expression shifting to one of practiced neutrality. From her seat, Ayanna couldn't hear the words, but the exchange was clear enough. Emily gestured toward Ayanna's row, her movements deliberate. The attendant glanced in Ayanna's direction, her eyes narrowing slightly before turning back to Emily. There was a brief pause, then a nod, and Emily returned to her seat. She's going to send someone, Emily said as she sat down, her voice quiet. You shouldn't have to ask twice for help. Ayanna offered a faint smile. Thank you, she said, though the weight in her chest hadn't entirely lifted. Experience had taught her that being seen didn't always mean being cared for. A few minutes later, another flight attendant appeared, a man with a more approachable demeanor. I understand you're not feeling well, he said, his tone professional but softer than the others. Is there anything specific you need? I've just been feeling faint and uncomfortable, Ayanna explained. I think some water and maybe an extra pillow might help. The attendant nodded. I'll get that for you right away, he said, his voice steady. He returned moments later with a pillow and a larger bottle of water, placing them gently on her tray table. Let me know if there's anything else, he added before stepping away. Ayanna adjusted the pillow behind her back, letting out a quiet sigh as the tension began to ease. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. Emily leaned closer. Better? She asked. Ayanna nodded. Better, she said softly. Thanks to you. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Ayanna's thoughts drifted, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of her reflection in the darkened window. She thought of how easily Emily's words had opened a door that had seemed firmly shut to her. It wasn't fair, she knew, but fairness wasn't something she had come to expect. Can I ask you something? Emily's voice broke the quiet. Ayanna turned to her, curious. Of course. Do you ever feel like? Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Like people don't see you the way they should? Like they only see what they expect to see? Ayanna considered the question, her fingers brushing absently over the edge of the water bottle. All the time, she said finally. It's like being part of the scenery there, but not really noticed. Unless, of course, you step out of place. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've seen it happen, she admitted, but I don't think I've ever really understood what it feels like. It's not just one thing, Ayanna said quietly. It's all the little things. The looks, the tones, the way people react or don't react. It's subtle, but it adds up. Emily was silent for a moment, her gaze steady. I can't change the world, she said finally, but I'll do what I can to make sure it's a little better. At least for you. Ayanna's lips curved into a small smile, a warmth spreading in her chest. That means more than you know, she said. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, the plane gliding through the night sky. Ayanna felt the weight of her earlier discomfort begin to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. It wasn't just Emily's actions, it was the fact that someone had seen her. Truly seen her, and chosen to act. As the plane began its descent, Ayanna glanced at Emily, who had fallen asleep with her head resting against the window. She thought of her own child, of the world she wanted to shape for them. A world where kindness wasn't the exception. Where being seen and valued wasn't a privilege reserved for a few. The plane touched down smoothly, the lights of the runway blinking in the darkness. Ayana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a little less alone. The cabin buzzed with the low hum of passengers preparing for arrival. Overhead bins were opened, bags shuffled, and flight attendants made their final rounds. Ensuring everything was secured, Ayana remained seated, her hands folded over her lap. Her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind alert. The subtle ache in her back persisted. A reminder of how far she had come and how far she still had to go. The voice of the captain broke over the intercom. Polite and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables stowed. We'll be landing shortly." Ayana glanced out the window at the city lights below, scattered like tiny constellations against the darkness. The plane dipped slightly, and she felt the familiar pull of gravity as the ground rose to meet them. There was something reassuring about the descent. The inevitability of reaching solid ground. It was a reminder that, no matter how turbulent the journey, every flight had to land. Across the aisle, Emily stirred, her head lifting from where it had rested against the window. She blinked a few times before turning to Ayana with a sleepy smile. "We're almost there," she said softly. Ayana nodded. "Almost." The plane jolted slightly as it hit a patch of turbulence, drawing a collective gasp from the passengers. Ayana instinctively placed a hand on her belly, grounding herself in the steady rhythm of her baby's movements. It was a small comfort, a reminder of her purpose. A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, checking seat belts and collecting stray cups. When she reached Ayana's row, her expression was carefully neutral, but her tone carried a faint edge of impatience. "Ma'am, please ensure your seatbelt is fastened." "It is," Ayana replied, her voice even. The attendant gave a perfunctory nod and moved on. Ayana let her gaze follow the woman for a moment, her thoughts turning over the interaction. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just another small moment of detachment, of being handled rather than cared for. Yet it lingered, adding to the quiet weight she carried. As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed to a crawl, the cabin filled with the sound of relieved murmurs and the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. Ayana stayed seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. She preferred not to rush, to let the crowd move ahead and avoid the jostling. Emily stood, her bag already slung over her shoulder. "Do you need help with anything?" she asked. "No, I'm okay," Ayana said, though she appreciated the offer. "Thank you." Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "You've been so patient through all of this," she said, her voice tinged with something close to admiration. "I don't know if I could have handled it the way you did." Ayana smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You get used to it," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It wasn't bitterness that laced her tone, but something quieter, more resigned. Emily's expression softened. "You shouldn't have to." The aisle finally began to clear, and Ayana rose slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. The movement sent a sharp twinge through her back, but she pushed it aside. She had endured worse. As she stepped into the aisle, a passenger behind her, an older man with a lined face and weathered hands, spoke up. "You go ahead, miss," he said, gesturing for her to move in front of him. His tone was kind, the gesture simple but sincere. "Thank you," Ayana said, her voice warm with gratitude. It was a small thing, but in a day filled with quiet dismissals, it felt significant. The walk through the jet bridge was slow, the air cool and slightly damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. Ayana's steps were measured, her hand still resting on her belly. As she entered the terminal, the bustle of the airport enveloped her, a sharp contrast to the relative calm of the flight. Ahead, Emily turned and gave a quick wave. "Take care, Ayana," she called, her voice carrying over the noise. "You too," Ayana replied, her smile genuine this time. She watched Emily disappear into the crowd, her heart heavy but also lightened by the memory of their brief connection. It wasn't everything, but it was something, a reminder that, Even in a world of indifference, there were moments of care, of being truly seen. Ayana made her way toward baggage claim, her steps steady despite the lingering ache in her back. She thought about the journey ahead. Not just in miles but in purpose. She thought about her child. About the world she hoped to help shape for them. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen quickly. But as the steady rhythm of her steps carried her forward, she felt a quiet determination settle within her. For now, she would keep moving, one step at a time, toward a future that felt just a little closer with every small act of kindness. The terminal was alive with movement, its fluorescent lights casting a stark glow over the scene. Passengers streamed toward baggage claim, their voices merging into an indistinct hum. Ayana moved carefully through the crowd, her hand brushing her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the chaos. The weight of the day, both physical and emotional, lingered in her steps, but she kept her pace steady. At the edge of the baggage carousel, Ayana paused. Around her, families reunited with hugs and laughter. Business travelers checked their watches, and children clung sleepily to parents. Ayana stood still, her gaze scanning the crowd until it landed on a familiar face. Malik. He stood tall, his broad shoulders slightly slouched as he leaned against a column. His eyes searched the crowd until they met hers. And in that moment, his face broke into a smile that felt like sunlight piercing through clouds. He pushed off the column and moved toward her with purposeful strides, his presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. "You made it," he said, his voice low and warm as he wrapped her in a careful embrace. His hand rested gently on her back, mindful of her condition. "I did," Ayana replied, her voice soft. "It wasn't the smoothest trip. But I'm here." Malik pulled back slightly, his eyes scanning her face. "You okay?" She hesitated, considering the weight of his question. "I'm okay now," she said finally, her words carrying more truth than she expected. They stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the terminal fade into the background. Malik's hand moved to her belly, his touch both protective and tender. "How's our little one doing?" he asked. "Strong," Ayana said with a small smile. "Resilient, just like their dad." Malik chuckled softly, but his expression grew serious. "And their mom," he said, his tone firm. "Don't forget that." A sudden announcement crackled over the loudspeakers, pulling them back to the present. Ayana gestured toward the carousel, where bags were beginning to tumble down the chute. Together, they waited, Malik stepping forward to retrieve her suitcase as soon as it appeared. He handled it with ease, placing it at her side before offering his arm. As they walked toward the exit, Ayana recounted pieces of her journey. She spoke of Emily, the stranger who had stepped in when no one else would. She mentioned the flight attendant, the dismissive tones, and the quiet moments that had made her feel invisible. Malik listened without interruption, his silence carrying the weight of understanding. "It's not just the big things," Ayana said as they reached the curb. "It's all the little things that pile up. The looks, the tone of voice, the way people decide without even thinking that you're not worth their time." Malik nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I know," he said quietly. "I see it too. Every day." They stood together in the cool night air, the distant sound of car engines blending with the rhythmic click of luggage wheels. Ayana leaned into Malik's side, drawing strength from his steady presence. "But," she continued, her voice softening, "there are people like Emily too. People who see you, who care enough to act." Malik glanced down at her, his expression thoughtful. "It doesn't erase the other stuff," he said, "but it reminds you it's not all bad." "Exactly," Ayana said, her voice carrying a note of hope. "It's not enough, but it's a start." A car pulled up, and Malik opened the door, helping Ayana settle into the seat before loading her bag into the trunk. As they drove away, the city lights flickering past the window, Ayana allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time that day. She thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical miles between here and home, but the larger path she would walk as a mother. She thought about the world her child would grow up in, a world that, in many ways, remained as uneven and imperfect as it had always been. But she also thought about the small moments of connection, the quiet acts of kindness that reminded her of what was possible. Malik reached over, his hand finding hers and giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked at him, her heart full of gratitude and resolve. The road wasn't easy, and it wouldn't become easier overnight. But as the car moved forward, carrying them into the night, Ayana felt a quiet certainty settle within her. They would face the challenges together, step by step, moment by moment, and for her child, for their future, that would be enough. For now, the morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the small nursery. Ayana sat in the rocking chair by the window, her hands resting gently on her belly. She had taken to sitting here most mornings, letting the stillness of the space settle over her. It was a kind of ritual, a moment to reflect before the day unfolded. Malik was in the next room, his voice a quiet murmur as he sorted through the baby clothes they had begun collecting. She smiled to herself, imagining the care he was taking with each tiny piece of fabric. He had always been meticulous, treating even the smallest details as if they mattered, and they did. The events of the past week played in her mind, not as sharp scenes but as softened impressions. The flight, the faces of strangers, the steady hum of the plane as it carried her forward, and Emily, her quiet ally in a world that so often seemed indifferent. Ayana hadn't expected to think of her so often, but the woman's kindness lingered, a reminder of what small, deliberate actions could mean. The memory of the flight attendant's coldness lingered too, though in a different way. It wasn't anger that Ayana felt, she had long since learned to temper that emotion, but a quiet disappointment. A recognition of how easily people could fail one another. The attendant had seen her, had heard her, and had chosen to look away. It wasn't unusual, but it was a truth Ayana wished her child wouldn't have to carry. Malik's voice broke through her thoughts. "You doing okay in there?" he called. "I'm fine," Ayana replied, her tone light. "Just thinking." He appeared in the doorway, holding up a tiny onesie with a pattern of stars. "Look at this," he said, his smile soft. "Can you believe someone so small is going to wear this?" Ayana laughed gently, reaching out to touch the fabric. "It's hard to imagine," she admitted, "but it's coming soon." He knelt beside her, resting his hand over hers. "You're going to be amazing," he said. "They're lucky to have you." "And you," she added, her voice firm. "They're lucky to have us both." They sat together for a while, the stillness of the room wrapping around them like a blanket. Ayana thought about the kind of parent she wanted to be, the kind of world she hoped to build for her child. She knew it wouldn't be perfect. The world rarely was, but she also knew that perfection wasn't the goal. It was about progress, about teaching her child to navigate the uneven terrain with strength and compassion. Later that afternoon, Ayana found herself at a community center, standing in front of a small group of women. Some were pregnant like her, their hands resting protectively on their bellies. Others were new mothers, their infants cradled in their arms. The room was filled with a quiet energy, a shared understanding of the journey they were all on. Ayana had been invited to speak, though she wasn't sure what she could offer. She wasn't an expert or an activist, just a woman trying to make sense of her place in the world. But as she looked at the faces in front of her, she felt a quiet confidence take hold. "I want to talk about being seen," she began, her voice steady, "about what it means to feel invisible, even when you're standing right in front of someone." The room was silent, the women listening intently. Ayana told them about the flight, about the small kindnesses and the quiet dismissals. She spoke of Emily, of Malik, and of her own determination to teach her child a different way. "It's not just about the big moments," she said. "It's about the little ones, the times we choose to look up, to notice, to care. That's where change begins." When she finished, there was a soft murmur of agreement, a few nods from the women in the audience. Ayana didn't need applause or praise, the connection was enough. She had spoken her truth, and it had landed where it was needed. That evening, back at home, Ayana stood by the window, watching the sky darken. The stars began to appear, one by one, small points of light in the vastness. She thought about her child again, about the world they would inherit. It wasn't perfect, but it held possibilities she would fight to nurture. Malik joined her, his hand finding hers. Together, they stood in the quiet, their shared presence a reminder of what mattered most. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, But it was one they would face together. And as Ayana looked out at the stars, she felt a quiet certainty settle within her. There was work to be done. But there was also hope. And for now, that was enough.